This is the Straight Truth Podcast, biblical answers to difficult questions from a Christian worldview. All right, well, welcome again to the Straight Truth Podcast. This is episode 322. Now, you brought up something recently that would be a good topic for us to discuss, mostly relating to parenting, discipline of children, and maybe the focus being the differences between maybe the approach to discipline from husbands and wives, and especially when they disagree on how to discipline children, whether they're young children or maybe teenagers or whatnot. And that can be especially challenging for couples to go through, and certainly it breeds some tension in the relationship, the marriage relationship. So we're in a situation where discipline is taking place, and a husband disagrees with the wife on how it's going. And now what the result of that, the discipline might be meted out, but what's the result of that is you and your wife are now tense, and it might last even a couple days because you disagree on this, and she doesn't agree with how you handled it, you don't agree with how she handled it. And then that also gets around, I'm sure you're going to address this, that word related, in the New Testament at least, for husbands not to, or fathers not to exasperate their children with their discipline. So I think it'd be good for us to talk through this topic and hear how you might address that, especially with couples.
Yeah, like we talk about often, Josh, in every realm of life, whether it's serving as elders in a church or it's serving in our home as mothers and fathers, you can't live the Christian life without judgment, meaning discernment. You have to make judgments. You have to make decisions. You don't have a black and white verse of Scripture that says this is what you do in every situation. And so it becomes a matter of being Spirit-led, submitted to Christ, submitted to the Word, and then trying to make good decisions. And I think the scenario I would like to set up, because this is what we're dealing with often in the church, you did a great job of giving voice to it, but let me just underscore it. Mm-hmm. Let's assume we have a mother and a father who both love the Lord, and they want to do what's honoring to Christ in a disciplined situation. But they have different judgments about what the situation calls for, and one is more lenient than the other. How do you handle that? And what's interesting about that when it comes to moms and dads is sometimes the harshness or the leniency can flip, depending upon which child you're dealing with or what the situation is that calls for the discipline. So one of the things that I think we've got to do is just acknowledge that there is such a thing as being too lenient, too passive when it comes to children. Children need discipline. Mm-hmm. They need rules. They need repercussions. They need to meet with repercussions when it comes to outright rebellion and disobedience. There's no doubt about that. So there can be such a thing as lenient or passive parenting where you're hurting your child by not disciplining them. That's true. But it's also true, I think this is what Ephesians 6:4 is warning about. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger. Mm-hmm. There is such a thing also as stirring up anger in children through over-discipline or through harsh discipline. That's also a reality. Every wrong is not criminal. We don't treat them like they're coming off Rikers Island. This is an ex-prison inmate that now I need to watch over. I mean, there is such a thing as dealing with a sin in a way that actually stirs up more sin. Mm-hmm. Because we're exasperating children. So just the acknowledgement that there is that spectrum from leniency to over-discipline, I think is helpful, because what both mom and dad ought to be able to agree on is we don't want to be guilty of either of those things. We don't want to be guilty of being lenient. We don't want to be guilty of over-disciplining. So that then should lay a foundation for mom and dad to talk about those things and pray about those things and work together on their perspectives when it comes to a particular discipline. Hey, how do you see this? Why do you see it that way? Let's talk about it and try to agree before we hand out the discipline. So that's one thing that comes to my mind. And at any point you jump in.
Well, who's ultimately responsible then? For the final word. So in a lot of cases, you have the mother is with the children more than the
Right,
father. In
right.
a lot of cases, not this isn't every case now, but usually, especially in Christian homes, you usually have the father working. Mother might do a little bit of side work or something, but they're raising the children. She's primarily disciplining all the time.
True.
And then the father comes home and he's kind of like the hero, He's like, they haven't seen him all day. It's great. They're hanging on his shoulder.
So true.
And it's a challenge. I want you to discipline. Do you know how they acted all day long?
Right.
And I would like you to do this. So who's ultimately responsible here?
The ultimate
how do you handle
responsibility, as we know, falls to dad. I mean, ultimately, because you have headship in the home and headship in the marriage, and there's no doubt. But any wise head, any wise leader should know what he doesn't know and should realize that mom also has a very real leadership in the home.
Mm-hmm.
It's one that you shepherd, you guide, but together you lead that home in some respects. And so you have the ultimate responsibility, but a good leader recognizes the leadership that mom has also, and you want to be supportive of that. And she is with the children all day. So to answer the question, dad has final word. But if you're in the position of constantly overruling your wife, then you guys are not doing a good job of communicating with each other. Ultimately, it's dad, but together you shepherd the children. Mom can be exasperated after a long day. Sometimes her judgments about discipline can be off a bit because she is frustrated. She's tired. She is exhausted with repeated patterns of behavior, which can sometimes skew your objectivity when it comes to now this particular behavior. I've seen this 30 times.
That's right. Yep.
But today isn't necessarily tied to the other 29. This is a new instance.
Okay.
And how are you going to deal with this, Mom? So sometimes dads can help through conversation to talk mom off the ledge a bit and say, okay, listen, I understand, that he or she has done this multiple times over the last 10 years, but today's a new day. So how are we going to deal with today?
Well, what if you're in this situation where you're both in the room?
Yeah.
And the husband's sitting on the couch and the mom's in the kitchen and there's a big discussion and then the discipline is starting to be directed at the child and the husband disagrees in that moment.
Yeah.
What would be maybe an advisable way to approach that? Would it be, let's cut it off entirely, let's get together and talk about this and then we'll approach the child? Or is it, I understand what you're saying, I want to approach it this way, and while the child is there as well? Because what do they discern from that? Okay, my parents have differing views on this.
Right. Yeah, and that's not disastrous for them to know that mom and dad have a different view on something. I would, as a general rule, I would say try not to disagree with the children in front of the children.
Okay. Disagree with your wife or spouse in front of the
children.
Right,
don't disagree with your spouse in front of the children. Unless the discipline that's about to be handed out reflects sinful anger that's really, going to hurt the child in some way. And I don't mean by that physically necessarily, although that can be true in some homes as well. But I mean just verbally or whatever. Unless there's something really destructive happening, I would counsel to let it go. Talk about it with her in a different context, get out of the room, let's sit down, let's talk about it, because you can always circle back around to the child and say, listen, mom and I talked about this. This is how we've decided to handle it instead, and where mom or dad needs to apologize to the child because you were exasperated, then that should happen as well. I think that's healthy home life. So we're all trying to do our best unto the Lord. I think the less that husbands and wives can disagree with each other in front of the children, the better. But again, it's not disastrous that our children see that sometimes we have different viewpoints on something. If we keep our spiritual head about us, if we're striving to honor Christ, if we're filled with the Spirit of God, if we want to do what's right, you can work through all these things with conversation. Sometimes in the room, sometimes outside of the room, sometimes in the moment, sometimes after the moment. But the more we can talk these things out and come to the right decisions, the better.
Yeah, I have so many thoughts about this because this probably all of us can speak to this from experience because we've had some of these difficulties, and I'm thinking about that scenario that you just described of maybe mom and dad should go outside of this situation, talk together, and then come and approach the child together after they've come to an agreement. But that is so hard to do.
It is hard.
I mean, for one, the discipline really stirs up an emotions in us because we are disagreeing with our child. And sometimes, especially if you have an older child, or if it's the 30th time, you're totally frustrated by the continuance of
Yes,
this
you
of
are.
this issue. And so it takes a lot of, what I'm thinking is it takes a lot of, God-given patience to be able to extract yourself from this and say to your spouse, one or the other, to your spouse, let's talk about this together, and then we'll come back in. That's a very hard thing to do.
Yeah, and sometimes, honestly, Josh, having lived through it, like you said, I mean, Jackie and I raised 4 children into adulthood. There are even some situations when they get older, and I'm thinking they're 15, 16 years old, that there's some real tension. And, sometimes the enemy of good is the attempt to be perfect. And so sometimes what you have to do is get through that situation. There's going to be some tension. This is what I said is going to happen. It is going to happen, whether you like it or not. Maybe your tone is not what it normally is. Maybe the energy is not what it normally is.
Yeah.
There's a sternness there. Maybe even some could say a harshness there in the moment. You get to your room, and we'll talk about this later. And then you settle down, and then you think about things, and then you come back and you approach it in a better way. Sometimes sin doesn't allow for what we would want, the perfect scenario where we're all smiling and talking through it, and then it gets settled.
Yeah.
Sometimes there's a little tension in the room but we have to circle back around and make it right later on. There have been times I've had to come back to my children and say, listen, I'm sorry for the way I responded to that, okay? Yeah. But my point still stands.
Sure.
This is not going to happen. This is wrong. And I didn't handle that the best way, and I ask you to forgive me, but this is the way it's going to be. And so we're always just striving to do the best we can in those situations.
Right. And it's also the case that you might have to go to your spouse and say, I'm sorry I handled this the way that I did.
Yes.
I shouldn't have raised my voice at you because we disagreed with this or this. However, I still think this approach that we're taking to our child is the right one, and that's the one I want to take. So even while acknowledging you're guilty of a sin you might have committed, you might still be right in your approach to
exactly
this.
Right.
Yeah.
And you're pointing out, Josh, something that I think is important for this whole discussion, which is, the successes you have in the moment are built on a much broader foundation, which is living for the Lord every day as a husband and wife, loving each other every day as a husband and wife. That pattern of faithfulness then allows you to overcome your failures in the moments, because we're all going to have those failures. So let's just, to use me as an example, let's say Jackie and I, we love each other, on a daily basis in a way that's striving to honor Christ. Then we have a disagreement in the midst of a discipline situation with a child. Yeah, I don't like the fact that we've had that disagreement. I don't like the fact that we're at odds with each other for an hour or two, or a day or two. There's a little tension more than normal or whatever. Yeah. But that pattern we've set of loving the Lord together and loving each other then allows us to overcome those failures in a way that is God-honoring, and we can both grow through it. So now you're not just talking about that situation, that you begin to have a discussion about what are we going to do the next time this happens? How do we need to work through this? And so there's room for growth. So what I'm saying is, what I want husbands and wives to aim at is learning that foundation. Like, are you on a daily basis striving to honor the Lord in your marriage relationship and in the raising of your children? If you're really both striving for that, then these failures you have in these moments of tension, you can overcome them, and you will overcome them, and you'll work through them, and it will be better as a result. But we wish they didn't occur, of course, and they're miserable.
Yeah, it's a sanctifying process. It really is. It's challenging to do that, especially if you have numerous kids. You have 4 or 5 kids, and you had mentioned earlier, each one of them is a little bit different, and so your approach to one might be quite different than your approach to another. What if you have? I was thinking as you were talking too. What if you have a child? Let's just maybe say an older child. I know younger children are perceptive of this, but there is the possibility of a child constantly going to one parent instead of the other because of favorability. And how do you maybe help erase that? Because that feels like more a disciplined situation as well. If your father disagrees with something that this child wants, but they know that the mother might agree with them, and they head to the mother to address whatever's going on. How do you deal with those scenarios? Because that also breeds tension between husband and wife. That's mostly what I'm getting at, is the kind of tension that comes out of that.
And it becomes really difficult when you agree with the child too. When you really agree with the child that mom or dad as a pattern doesn't handle particular situations well.
Hmm.
But what you have to do is uphold the authority of the parent. You have to, son, I don't agree with mom when she behaves that way, or let's turn that around. Son, I don't agree with dad when he behaves that way, but he's your father. And you have to respect his authority, and you have to respect his role in our home. So you uphold the other parent to the child. But then I think also there have to be honest conversations with each other about patterns that are making it hard in the parenting realm. So, maybe Jackie comes to me and says, Rich, listen, here are how the kids feel that you think about these things. I might not like hearing that, but it helps me to hear it. And so she and I can talk about that. They think you're really harsh when it comes to this or that. Okay, well, let's talk about that. Here's why I handle those situations the way that I do. Here's what my thinking process is. And then she can be free with me about how she disagrees with me on that. And you talk through those things. So I would say you uphold parental authority to the child, helping them process biblically how to deal even with the failures of their parents. So I don't think we help our children to take the position that mom or dad are always right, because we're not always right. So sometimes there's a time to say, I don't agree with your father on that, but he's your father. And this is how the Bible would instruct us to deal with failure. So there's that kind of constant, you think about church discipline. People always think about, the third and fourth step, tell it to the church and put them out, when discipline really is about just loving each other on a daily basis and helping each other in our sanctification process. Well, the same is true in home life. We need to help each other grow in the Christian life. And so I'm not going to always be right. And Jackie needs to help me be right more often. And she also has to help our children process my failures in a way that helps me grow and helps them grow. So the Bible, thank God, God gives us in His Word steps to take when someone mistreats us or someone isn't in the right. We need to help our children think through that as well. That kind of honesty in a family, that kind of honest confession of sin and forgiveness of sin, and we're all as a family striving together to become more Christ-like, that mindset helps disciplinary situations. Because now, even when there's failure, it's not, the house is on fire kind of crisis. We've lived through this together. We know we all fail each other in one way or another, but we can't allow wrong to go unaddressed because we're not perfect, and we can't maintain that we're right when we're wrong either. So if we have that mindset, then together as a family we can grow, and I think it's helpful.
Yeah, I'm also thinking too how challenging it is, and I want your opinion on this, is when a husband and wife disagree about a situation like this, whether it's discipline. This could be numerous things. Discipline maybe, what the kids can or can't do, or what they have said, or how we address their problems. Well, they can't agree. Do you agree to disagree? Is that just a good way
who can't agree?
Parents cannot agree together. So you gave a scenario, where a wife is saying to a child, I don't agree, but he is your father. I don't agree with how he handles. He's your father. You should respect and honor him and his authority and choice in this. So relations of submission and authority there. But what if it's a discipline situation? What if it's that the father says he cannot agree with his wife?
Yeah.
Or in what situation does he maybe say, if I enter into this disciplinary situation, it's going to be worse, or maybe it's better that I allow it to go as the way it's going, and then later in the evening when we're private together, we can talk through those things, and I can share how I disagree. I mean, how do you handle those? Like, how we disagree on how we do this. Where do you go?
So again, a father has a responsibility. A believing father has a responsibility to both shepherd his wife and shepherd his children, even as she shepherds children also. So I'm shepherding my wife even as she's shepherding our children. And as brother and sister in the Lord, we have mutual responsibility to help each other grow. So she can correct me and I can correct her, and we do that in a way that recognizes our different roles as husband and wife and father and mother. So here's what I'm thinking. I want me just putting my foot down and going, this is the way it's going to be the last case scenario.
Okay.
Like I don't want to go to that over and over again. I think that reflects poor shepherding on my part. If I'm constantly having to do that, we're not having good conversations. We're not growing together if that's happening. But if I think there is something that really is important in the moment, and this, it's consequential, the decisions we're about to make, then I might just have to at some point go, honey, I hear you, but no, we're not going to do it that way. I want to support the fact she is there with the children all the time. She does know this situation probably better than I do because she's living in it. So to the degree that I can support her, I always want to support her. But if I were to believe she's really doing wrong and it's going to hurt our children in some way, like let's just say exasperate them, form bitterness in them, then I can't affirm that. And I would have a good conversation with her privately and let her know why I can't affirm it. Try to talk through it. Like I said, that's a last case scenario for me to just go, no, we're going to do it this way. But I do believe that kind of final decision-making authority does rest with a husband and a father at some point. And so there may be a situation where you have to do that. I talked to a brother recently that he talked about his wife and how she has pure motives, but she is a very strict disciplinarian. And he said that, it would result in some cases, his children being grounded for 8 years. If he were just he's kidding. Yeah. He's kidding. He's exaggerating, But that's what it would be like, like a lifetime of grounding until you finally leave our home. Right. That would exasperate a child, to put them in a situation where they can't do anything because they can't do it perfectly. Yeah. So.
And yet there's the effect where if you say the discipline is this, but you don't follow through with it, that can also have a negative effect.
It sure can.
Certainly on a child.
In fact, that's one form of exasperation. We always think of exasperating as over-discipline, but under-discipline can also exasperate a child. They don't feel loved. There are no boundaries. No one keeps up with them. No one ever gives them a consequence for something they've done wrong. That could also be exasperating to a child. Internally, stirring up a bit of anger, like, why don't they care about me? So yeah, it can exist on both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, and I guess what we're ultimately talking about here is harmony in the home and how important that is for really the flourishing of that family and possibly even just the belief and knowledge of the truth, a confidence in the Word of God that has an effect in the home that brings harmony. And harmony involves discipline, and harmony sometimes involves disagreeing that needs to be sorted out.
Harmony requires order. God has given us the order. So roles of father, mother, husband, wife, children, all set forth in Scripture. Something we love about our God and about His Word is the Bible isn't given to us in a way that assumes sinlessness.
Right. Yeah.
It's teaching recognizes our sinfulness. So we're told what to do when we fail. And so there's order there also. So children are to be disciplined when they sin. We know that. We acknowledge that together. What we're struggling with and grappling with is what should the discipline be given this particular failure.
Right.
And that's where, as much as we can, Mom and Dad, recognizing the order that God has set forth for fathers and mothers and husbands and wives, we get together, we talk it through. I acknowledge her role, which she's home more than I am, dealing with the children more than I am. I want to acknowledge that, fully acknowledge that, and I want to uphold her honor in the sight of my children. At the same time, I'm called, though, to help her too. She's the weaker vessel. I'm called to give shepherding to her.
Sure.
So I'm not helping her if I think I see something in her discipline that isn't right, to just let it go on. That's not really helping her. So where I really believe she's sinning, let's say, in the way she's disciplining our children, maybe she's harsh or over-disciplining them, I want to have that conversation with her. If we both recognize the differences in our roles, she ought to have a willing ear to hear my concerns. Just as I'm willing to recognize you're home with them all the time. So I have appreciation, right? I love her and appreciate her and uphold her. If we can do that together, then we ought to be able to settle somewhere on what is reasonable with respect to discipline. That gets harder, as you've already noted, in a moment, in a high-tension moment. But we should be able to talk through those things, which could involve circling back with the child, or it can involve a sort of a pre-planned,
approach.
If this
Right.
happens again, how do we want to handle this? So bottom line is it's work. It's tiring.
Yeah, that's true.
Parenting is not easy.
Right.
It's going to involve time and conversation. If you're not willing to really talk with each other you're not going to do it well. So if we do that faithfully, the Lord will help us. He will help us arrive at a place where there is peace and harmony. So there's order. There are functional roles that God has set forth. The Scriptures do not assume sinlessness in a home. We're going to deal with sin issues. We're going to deal with our own sin issues. And if we help as a family, if we're all aiming at sanctification, honoring Christ in this home, we can arrive at a place where we do it well. Not perfectly, but we do it well.
Thanks again for joining us for this episode of the Straight Truth Podcast. Now, Straight Truth is listener supported. So if you'd like to find out ways how you can help us to continue to produce this podcast, you can go to our website and find out ways to do that, straighttruth.net. At that website, you'll also find links to all of our previous episodes and our social media channels, so be sure to check it out. Straight Truth is a production of Walking in Grace Ministries, the preaching and teaching ministry of Pastor Richard Caldwell. For more information, go to walkingingrace.org.